First night at home, I just lay awake looking at him.
He's on fire.
It's colic, Freud, that's all it is.
What do you think you're doing? He needs his mum. He's got me.
You need to go home and make it right with Chantel.
It's a thing called love. One group of friends, 6 looks at love. Next Tuesday at 9 on BBC One.
There'll be a sniper rifle left at the scene. It'll have my fingerprints on it.
It's over, Tom.
I'm just trying to clear my name.
I'm launching an investigation sanctioned by Downing Street.
I'm innocent, Harry.
Well, you just better be innocent for all our sakes.
Spooks starts Monday at 9, BBC One.
This is BBC One Southwest. Now the news, presented by Hugh Edwards with Julia Peat.
Michael Howard tells his party it can win the next election by restoring trust in politics. He delights Conservative members by offering a much more hardline approach to Europe and asks voters for a chance to serve.
I want to give Britain just a tiny bit back in return for what Britain has given me.
We'll be assessing the impact and the implications of Mr. Howard's speech. Also tonight, inside Gaza, a special report on the latest Israeli actions. Cheney versus Edwards, the vice presidential candidates prepare to square up tonight. And Arsenal celebrate one of the biggest sponsorship deals ever seen in football.
Here in the southwest, a father threatens legal action after 5 months' delay over the release of his daughter's body. And the campaigner fighting to save a specialist unit for brain injuries.
Good evening. In his first conference speech as party leader, Michael Howard has set out his plans for a future Conservative government. He offered voters a rather dramatic change in relations with the European Union, saying no to the new constitution, no to the social chapter, and no to the common fisheries policy. Setting the scene for the election campaign, which is expected next year, Mr. Howard said people were fed up with broken pledges, and he promised more police, cleaner hospitals, and controlled immigration. Mark Mardell reports now from Bournemouth.
On to applause and Elgar, but can he go on to win the election? Michael Howard wrestled with a conundrum. When the people distrust politicians, all politicians, how do you make your party stand out from the crowd?
In the real world, if you say you're going to do something, you do it. And if you screw up, you can lose your job. It's called accountability.
That means a detailed timetable of action if the Conservatives win the election. Fairly small promises tied to specific dates.
It will put us on the line in a way that no government has ever been before. There'll be no wiggle room.
In Law and Order, that translates as less form filling for the police, 5,000 more officers, and an end to early prison release.
The gloves will come off. What Giuliani did in New York, what Ray Mallon did in Middlesbrough, we will do for the whole of Britain. A war on crime.
In health and education, government targets would be scrapped from day one, but nothing specific on tax.
Families know better than any government can how best to spend their money. So be in no doubt. When I can, I will cut taxes.
He wouldn't only say no to the euro and the European Constitution, but confront the EU over fisheries and the social chapter. There was no direct message to the UK Independence Party, but there didn't need to be.
If you want to bring powers back from Brussels to Britain, whatever party you're from, come and join us.
A Conservative government would pull out of the UN's Convention on Refugees and set a limit on people coming to Britain.
We can't allow unlimited immigration to Britain to continue. We need a government that gets a grip on this shambles.
Hard policies, but a less harsh Mr. Howard, with little of the trademark scorn for his opponents. Just this on the Prime Minister.
In the run-up to the war, Tony Blair did not tell the truth. He did not give a truthful account of the intelligence he received. He did not behave as a British Prime Minister should.
Michael Howard is not terribly comfortable talking about his private side, but he stepped forward to tell his own story. His father, an immigrant to Britain, he was born as Hitler ravaged the continent.
My grandmother was one of those who were killed in one of those concentration camps. And if it hadn't been for Winston Churchill, and if it hadn't been for Britain, I would have been one of them too. I want to give Britain just a tiny bit back in return for what Britain has given me. Thank you very much.
This was a first for Michael Howard. Once noted for almost brutal speeches, he left some of his audience in tears, others more cheerful than before. There's no doubt in this hall they feel buoyed up, happier than they expected to be. But as one MP put it to me, this really is an important moment. If we don't get movement after this, then it'll be like the charge of the Light Brigade. Mark Mardell, BBC News, Bournemouth.
And the day had begun well for the Conservatives when they heard that the UK Independence Party had lost its biggest financial backer. Paul Sykes withdrew his support after UKIP's decision to fight every seat at the general election, including those being contested by Eurosceptic Tories. But tonight, Alan Brown, a businessman from Kent, said he'd make up any shortfall in UKIP's funds. Vicky Young reports now.
Millionaire businessman Paul Sykes has given over £1 million to the UK Independence Party, but he's unhappy that it plans to field candidates against all Conservative MPs at the next election.
Some of the candidates would be standing against fellow Eurosceptic MPs, and I felt that were counterproductive to our purpose, which is to get Britain out of the European Union.
Others in UKIP agree that that decision was a tactical error. They say the party got carried away at its conference last weekend after a good performance in the Hartlepool by-election. But today, former TV presenter Robert Kilroy-Silk, the party's high-profile member, angrily rejected the criticism.
I think that's extremely patronising for anybody in the party to suggest that those decent men and women on Saturday who contributed to that debate and who then voted were somehow not compos mentis, drunk on euphoria.
Mr Kilroy-Silk, a former Labour MP, has brought a touch of celebrity glamour to UKIP, but his personal leadership ambitions and stated desire to kill off the Tories have upset his colleagues. UKIP's problems have brought some welcome relief to the Tories here in Bournemouth, but pro-Europeans say they'll be watching closely for any sign that the party's hardening its stance on the EU in order to lure Mr Sykes back into the fold. Shadow Cabinet members deny they've given Mr Sykes any promises on European policy.
We're not negotiating with Paul Sykes and he's not negotiating with us. We've set out our stall on Europe. We say no to the Constitution, no to the currency, and yes to repatriation of powers. We wish to renegotiate a better deal for Britain.
But as Paul Sykes said he'd withdraw funding from UKIP, there was some good news for the party tonight. Another donor said he'd make up any shortfall. Vicky Young, BBC News, Bournemouth.
Well, let's talk to our political editor, Andrew Marr, who's in Bournemouth. Andrew, plenty for the UKIP supporters and potential supporters to think about after Mr Howard's speech. What for you were the main implications of this harder line on Europe?
Well, I think the first thing to emphasise, Hugh, is that there's not new policy from Michael Howard, but if you listen to what he's actually saying about the EU, particularly when it comes down to the things that he wants no part of, the common fisheries policy, the social chapter, never mind the constitution, he is talking about renegotiation. So UKIP are against Britain's membership of any European Union. The Conservatives are against Britain's membership of this European Union now and the way it's going. In effect, Michael Howard is promising people who don't like the idea of the EU one heck of a punch-up with them if he's re-elected. And a lot of people who've been supporting UKIP, not just from the Tories, but across the spectrum, may well be tempted by that. And the other thing, of course, it's traditional at this time of year for all the parties to have a bit of a leadership kerfuffle. The Conservatives, with no great sense of tradition, have failed to offer us any leadership kerfuffle this week. but UKIP have stepped kindly into the gap, and a lot of people here are delighted about that.
Not just Europe, Andy, as you were suggesting, plenty of other policies mentioned. What was the overall impact of the speech for you?
Well, I think the most important thing is this notion of trust. Very strong belief by Michael Howard that the British public have frankly turned off almost all politicians. They don't believe what they're hearing. Result, he's offering in effect something a bit like New Labour's original pledge card of promises, but he's tying it to a calendar and a timetable. The other thing that I'd say is that he is very much looking at the middle spectrum, the middle ground, centre-right territory. He is not listening to those voices in the party who say, let's sound a lot more radical on tax, let's sound much more aggressive still on Europe, let's really shake things up. He is going for the centre ground, and that pleases a lot of the rising figures in the party around him, because they believe that's the only way he can possibly start to shift this huge Labour majority.
Andrew in Bournemouth, thank you very much. Several Palestinian militants have been killed in Israeli missile attacks in Gaza this evening. They're the latest deaths in a big operation which began after 2 Israeli children were killed in a rocket attack last week. Dozens of Palestinians have been killed in the fighting around the Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza. From there, Orla Guerin sent us this report.
Jabalia, 1 week on. When the Israeli army finally let us into Gaza, this is what we found. The ruins of a kindergarten, just part of the damage done. An early lesson in hardship. This father says now his children will grow up with hate.
The Israelis destroyed their kindergarten, they destroyed their trees, they destroyed their playgrounds, and they will definitely keep this on their souls when they become young people, and they will continue the fight with Israel.
Israel says it came in here because of Palestinian rocket attacks that killed 2 of its children. We went looking for the militants, but they wouldn't be filmed and escorted us out. And all around us today, Israeli forces making their presence felt.
This is about as far as we can go. We can't risk going down the street behind us because the Israeli army positions are just ahead, only about 100 meters away. Local people are staying inside, hoping to be safe. There's an unmanned Israeli aircraft buzzing over our heads. And there's every likelihood that as long as the Israeli operation continues, there will be more civilian casualties.
Like the girl killed yesterday inside this house, now in the line of fire. Maher told me his 16-year-old daughter, Islam, was hit by Israeli bullets as she stood at the kitchen window baking bread. If I could find an Israeli soldier now, he says, I'd behead him. In 7 days, Israel has killed over 70 Palestinians, about half civilians. Even for this conflict, that's a brutal week. Orla Guerin, BBC News, Gaza.
Donald Rumsfeld, the US Defense Secretary, says he's seen no hard evidence of a link between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, which was one of the principal reasons President Bush gave for invading Iraq. The admission, which he's since tried to retract, could make life difficult for Vice President Dick Cheney, because he is due to take part in a live television debate with his Democrat challenger, Senator John Edwards, in just a few hours' time. Well, that debate takes place in Ohio, and our correspondent Matt Fry is there.
Hugh, vice presidential debates tend to be footnotes of the campaign, but this one is different. Dick Cheney is arguably the most powerful vice president in US history. John Edwards is a very effective campaigner indeed. Add to that the closeness of the race, today's news, and even the location, and you might get some very interesting viewing. Cleveland, Ohio, not a favorite destination, unless you're one of the candidates, that is. They can't stay away from the most battled-over city in any battleground state. An obvious place, then, for today's debate, which has suddenly become much more important. One reason, a race once again too close to call. The other, some bad news for the Bush administration from unexpected quarters. Paul Bremer, America's viceroy who ran Iraq until last June. Now he's criticized his former bosses for not sending enough troops and for initially allowing looting and lawlessness to prevail in Iraq. He later issued a statement saying he still stood behind the president and the occupation, but the damage had been done. Then this from Donald Rumsfeld, speaking his mind. Again, but this time about one of the reasons for invading Iraq.
What exactly was the connection between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda?
To my knowledge, I have not seen any strong, hard evidence that links the two.
Contrast this with the claims repeatedly made by one of today's debaters about Saddam.
He had long established ties with Al-Qaeda.
The result, more pressure on the vice president, who is famous for staying unruffled. Here he is at his ranch in Wyoming. Apparently he's been preparing for the debate by fishing for trout. Not to be trumped on the unruffled stakes is John Edwards.
All right.
He's been out snapping up a giant pumpkin for Halloween. Tonight, one of America's most successful trial lawyers comes head-to-head against the eloquent bruiser of the Bush administration. It won't be dull.
And it may matter, because Dick Cheney is, after all, the ideological godfather of many of the more controversial policies of the Bush administration. He will have to defend his record tonight, and John Edwards will have to try and get him, well, ruffled.
Matt, thank you very much. Tony Blair is on his way to Africa tonight for talks on the many problems facing that continent, what he once called a scar on the conscience of the world. Among the biggest obstacles to development are armed conflicts, which have crippled many African states. Some of the worst fighting has been in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's endured a 5-year war involving several of its neighbours, in which up to 4 million people have died. Fergal Keane has been to eastern Congo, where, despite a deal to end the fighting, rebel militias are still carrying out attacks.
It happened just over a mile from this UN checkpoint. Scores of houses burned, people massacred. We found survivors sitting on the ruins of their homes. Of the 14 killed, 7 were children. The photographs of the victims are too gruesome to be shown. The man took us to a house where an entire family had been burned alive. When the Ngiti tribe attacked, he says, these people thought they would be safe in the house. They thought the fighting would pass by, but they burned them like meat.
It's been called the biggest war in the world, but it's only when you come somewhere like this that you get a sense of the individual agony involved. In Congo, 4 million people have been killed. Millions have been displaced. Villages, towns, an entire country has been traumatized.
A scar on the conscience of the world. That's what Tony Blair called this kind of violence. For years, the world did nothing to stop the killing. Now, all-out warfare has abated, but the militias remain armed. There are too few UN troops like these Bangladeshis to enforce peace.
Militia.
Have you seen the militia, the Major asks. He seemed perplexed by the violence.
For a silly reason, they start fighting with each other. And this fighting ends up with the killing of 20, 30, even 100 people.
But what's happening to these people is the direct result of decades of corruption, poverty, and war. Here, the skulls remind visitors of the price paid. This is Nyankunde Hospital.
2 years ago, 2,000 people were murdered here.
Many were patients dragged from their beds. 15-year-old Liabo hid in the roof of his family home. When I got down from the ceiling, I escaped, he says. But when I came back, I saw 5 corpses of my family. They had been beheaded. Once this hospital, established by British missionaries, provided health care for tens of thousands. Now, like so much of Congo, it is ruined. A handful of patients linger. This girl seriously ill with malaria. This old man with rotting bed sores. Bewildered. The local chief believes a much bigger international effort is going to be needed to secure the peace.
We are confident this country can be rebuilt if we can just stop the killing. It's because of a succession of wars. It's like this.
Back at the scene of the latest massacre, night is approaching. It's dusk now, and these people know they can be attacked again at any time. There simply aren't enough UN troops to secure every village. That's the great challenge facing Mr. Blair and his Africa Commission. Because if it's to mean anything, it's got to deliver security for people like these. But if history's any guide, he'll have to confront not only the warlords, but the apathy of the world as well. Fergal Keane, BBC News, Eastern Congo.
A mentally ill man who was detained in a psychiatric hospital against his carer's wishes was held unlawfully, according to the European Court of Human Rights. The man, who is 55 and is autistic, was kept in the hospital in Surrey on the opinion of just one doctor. The ruling means that thousands of similar cases may now have to be reviewed, as Alison Holt explains.
We've won! Relief after a long fight for John and his carers. We've changed his name as he can't be identified for legal reasons. But John has autism, can't speak and has limited understanding. He was held in a psychiatric hospital for 5 months because a psychiatrist said it was in his best interests. His carers, though, say he was traumatized.
He'd lost a dramatic amount of weight. He was self-injuring. There was blood all over him, all over the walls.
John couldn't say what he wanted, and his carers had no official way of challenging the doctor's decision.
There has to be some sort of status given to all the people in that individual's life, and it shouldn't be a one-person decision as to what is in their best interest.
Ironically, if doctors at the now-closed Surrey Hospital had sectioned John under the Mental Health Act, the decision would have been reviewed. But he was held under common law, and that meant no safeguards. The Bournemouth Hospital has been empty for years. In fact, there are only 1 or 2 of the old buildings still standing. But this ruling is significant because it's estimated there are thousands of vulnerable people in hospitals and nursing homes who aren't in a position to give consent for their treatment.
What we hope is that in future, those people will only be admitted to hospital and will only be kept in hospital because proper review procedures say that they should be there and that they should stay there or that they should leave.
The implications of today's ruling on John's case are now being studied by the government. It will have to decide what impact it will have on new mental health legislation currently going through Parliament. Alison Holt, BBC News, Surrey.
In his conference speech today, Michael Howard said the Conservatives would offer wider choice in education. Their plans include a voucher system, allowing parents to buy education at a school of their choice, either state or private. Mr. Howard highlighted a similar scheme in Sweden, and our education correspondent Mike Baker has been there to see it in action.
Sweden, home of the modernised welfare state, has long inspired Britain's left. Now the Conservatives are set to adopt Swedish education policy.
For 12 years now, Sweden has had a school's choice policy. It means parents can choose any school they like, including private schools, and the state pays. Although initially extremely controversial, now, rather like council house sales in England, is a policy no government here could imagine reversing.
For Inga, Sweden's voucher scheme meant getting her daughter into an independent school she couldn't otherwise afford. The fees are paid by the state, and parents can't be made to pay more.
As a parent, I think it's very important to make these choices together with the children, of course. Because Paula didn't like it in her old school, and she wasn't happy at all. And now she studies better, and she has lots of new friends.
Paula's new school is run by a profit-making company. Each student through the door brings government funding equal to the cost of educating a pupil at state schools. Before vouchers, there were very few private schools here. Now there are almost 800, educating 6% of students. In some areas, 30% go private.
Our profit comes from satisfied parents and pupils, from good results. That's the very basic thing to make a profit. And if we don't perform well, we wouldn't make any profit at all.
Private schools which accept vouchers cannot select students in any way. But as it's mainly better educated parents who use vouchers, they have increased social segregation. This worries the teachers' union, which otherwise supports school choice.
At first we were rather suspicious, but now we have guarantees, for they must use educated teachers, the schools are open to all pupils, and we have a financing system that works, and they can't take tuition fees. But now we also have to keep our eyes up for segregation danger.
Sweden's school choice seems to work, but the big question is whether the Tories could make it work in Britain, where there's already a thriving and expensive independent school system, which might not accept the restrictions required in a voucher scheme. Mike Baker, BBC News, Stockholm.
Arsenal Football Club have announced a new sponsorship deal worth £100 million over the next 15 years. Arsenal's new backer, Emirates, is paying to sponsor Arsenal's new stadium for 15 years and their shirts for 8 years. Adam Parsons explains all.
Arsene Wenger, architect of Arsenal's success, today celebrating a windfall, a £100 million sponsorship deal with the airline Emirates. When the club's new home is finally finished, Highbury will be history and Arsenal will play at the Emirates Stadium.
When a big company commits for 15 years, that's a big trust in the way we run the club. And I think we do not always realize here at Arsenal that we are very popular all over the world.
Arsenal believe a new stadium will mean more fans, more cash and more success. And in modern football, the link between money and trophies has never been more apparent. Well, Arsenal are guaranteed £100 million from this deal, with Emirates stumping up an average of just under £7 million a season for the next 15 years. But the Gunners aren't the only club to cash in on sponsorship. Manchester United receive £9 million a season from their shirt sponsor Vodafone, while the German giants Bayern Munich have sold the naming rights to their new stadium for more than £4 million a year. And some think it's the airline that's done better out of this deal.
They've managed to get a good deal for what they're getting. They're paying not so much money as they perhaps they could have paid. And certainly if things go forward and Arsenal gets much more popular, Emirates will be laughing all the way to the bank.
For Emirates, the point is to be associated with success, so all Arsenal have to do is keep winning. Adam Parsons, BBC News.
We'll be back in a few minutes with the latest on the day's headlines. Now it's time to join our news teams across the UK. Bye for now.
Hello, good evening. A father is threatening to bring a prosecution against a city coroner for failing to release the body of his toddler for burial 5 months after her alleged murder. David Moffat from Plymouth says he can't properly grieve until 2-year-old Michaela's body is returned to him. Spotlight's Home Affairs correspondent Simon Hall has this report.
It was back in May that Michaela Moffat died. Her father David says that despite repeated requests, 5 months on, the Plymouth coroner still hasn't released Michaela's body so he can bury her.
As each day goes by, it gets worse and worse. It's hard every time I go to sleep at night, it's just hard waking up the next day wondering what this day's going to bring. Going to bed, going to sleep, just hoping that the next day though we'll get a phone call saying that our baby's been released so that we can at last bury her. And it's just horrendous. It's terrible. We just can't go on like this much longer. Something has to be done.
Mr. Moffat is so angry, he's now considering bringing a private prosecution against the Plymouth coroner, Nigel Meadows. In a statement, Mr. Meadows said Michaela's case was a unique one, involving complicated legal issues, which meant it was necessary to retain her body for longer than was normal. He said he was anxious to release Michaela's body as soon as possible, but could not say exactly when that would be. Mr. Moffat says his family need to bury Michaela to help them grieve.
At this moment in time, we can't actually say goodbye properly. That's all any of us want to be able to do, just lay her to rest properly. At this moment in time, as we sit here, she's still at Derriford Hospital, and that's where she's been for nearly 5 months now. And we just want her body so we can bury her, so we can say goodbye properly.
A Plymouth man, Gavin Fletcher,
has been charged with Michaela's murder.
A man branded Britain's most prolific paedophile has been ordered to pay £50,000 towards the cost of bringing him to justice. William Goad was jailed yesterday for life at Plymouth Crown Court after pleading guilty to sexually abusing young boys over a 40-year period. A Devon businessman has been found guilty of attempting to murder his wife. 54-year-old Ian Hervard was convicted after Exeter Crown Court heard he slashed his wife's throat and stabbed her in the back during a row at the family home in Dawlish. Mrs. Hervard, who's a police officer, told the court she lived in fear of her estranged husband. He's been remanded in custody while psychiatric reports are prepared. Patients who say their lives have been transformed by a specialist brain injuries unit in Exeter say they'll fight to stop it being moved. Plans are being drawn up which could lead to patients being moved away from Marden House to the city's main hospital. Hamish Marshall reports.
Gerald Dixon was told he'd never leave hospital after a hemorrhage caused a blood clot on his brain. He's lost part use of his right arm and leg, and speaking can be difficult. But treatment at Marden House has allowed him to go home.
I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Marden House. You know, they've done marvellous to me, you know, to what I used to be, you know. It's given me a great amount, as I'm able to go out in the village on my own, in the electric scooter, and well, the wife has helped me a lot.
But others may not be so lucky. Money-saving plans drawn up by Devon Social Services and Primary Care Trusts could see the 10 acute beds transferred to the RD&D hospital.
In some way, it's sort of very homey. You can come and go. You have your own room, your own little kitchen. Your visitors can come. I mean, I was able to visit Gerald whenever I wanted to. It's very important. Sometimes if he was having physio, then I'd have to wait. But you don't mind that sort. You know that things are happening, so it doesn't really matter.
No one from Health or Social Services was available for an interview today, but the Royal Devon and Exeter Hospital said in a statement the plans were at a very early stage. It also said that it's anticipated there will need to be a process involving patients, their representatives and other partners before any formal consultation. 5 years ago, Pam Coughlin won a legal test case to stay at Marden, and she's against the latest proposals.
If people don't recover and they have to be in a hospital for years and years, then it's going to be expensive and an ongoing expense for years. Whereas if the rehab is done properly, that might be the end of their need for any kind of hospitalisation.
Campaigners will use any consultation period to show why the plan shouldn't go ahead.
South West pensioners were among those lobbying the Conservative Party conference in Bournemouth today. Campaigners were demanding more money for older people, as well as calling for greater recognition of their needs. The demonstration came as Tory leader Michael Howard promised he would give pensioners back their dignity. Health officials in Torbay are getting a government grant of £115,000 to help reduce the growing number of teenage pregnancies. The grant has increased almost fourfold since it was introduced 5 years ago. Football now, and it was an emotional evening for Exeter City manager Eamon Dolan on his final match in charge of his side. His team, though, were unable to give him a winning send-off. The Grecians at home to top-of-the-table Barnet went down 3-0. Dolan is leaving St James Park after 13 years to take over as Reading youth team coach. Look at the weather now for tomorrow. Often dry and sunny, but with a chance of the odd blustery shower and the brisk southwesterly wind. Top temperature around 16 degrees Celsius. That's it from us for tonight. Back to Hugh in London. Have a very good night.
The main news tonight, Michael Howard has told the Conservatives they can win the next election by restoring trust in politics. He promised a hard line on Europe, more police and controlled immigration. Newsnight's on BBC Two now, but from all of us here on the 10 o'clock team, good night.
Discussing the future of the UK Independence Party, former Chat Show host Robert Kilroy-Silk joins Tim Sebastian for some hard talk tonight at 11:30 on BBC News 24.
Good evening. The weather's looking quite settled for the end of this week, but it's shaping up for a pretty rough night across northern parts of the UK. This curl of cloud is a developing area of low pressure. It's already producing some pretty heavy rain across a good part of Scotland. That's now setting in across Northern Ireland. It'll move on to affect Northern England and North Wales later on in the night. It's only half the story, though. Strong winds are picking up as well. In fact, we'll see gales running down from Argyll, funneling through the central lowlands with gusts up to around 60 miles an hour. Northern parts of Northern Ireland also at risk from those gales for a time. And then through into tomorrow morning, we're going to see the gales moving down into Northern England. Again, 60 mile an hour gusts, certainly a possibility, enough to produce a bit of debris on the roads and make things quite tricky for high-sided vehicles. So a pretty unpleasant start to the day tomorrow across most northern parts of the UK. Further south, OK, there'll be 1 or 2 showers perhaps for the western side of Wales, southwest England, but for the bulk of England and Wales it will be a dry and quite a sunny start to the day. But like today, a few showers will get going, drifting eastwards on the fairly brisk winds, but again, like today, they'll push through fairly quickly with sunny skies returning. And at the same time, further north, we'll find the showers becoming a little more scattered, but even so, still some longer spells of rain quite possible. At least the winds will start to ease down a touch, but not until later on. So it is going to feel quite cold, I think, across northern parts. Top temperatures, well, 12 or 13 degrees. That's going to feel quite chilly, I think. Further south, about the same as today, something between 14 and 16 degrees. Not too bad if you can get out into that sunshine. The winds aren't going to last that long, though, pushing out into the North Sea during tomorrow night, just coming in from the north for a time, though, during the latter part of this week. So that's going to introduce some slightly colder air for a time. And as the winds fall light, well, that's the recipe for perhaps the first significant frost of the autumn for many parts of the UK, particularly, I think, from northern England northwards. Still cold enough as well for a bit of snow across the Scottish mountains, I think, on Thursday, because it looks like it's Scotland, perhaps Northern Ireland, that'll see most of the showers during Thursday, fairly scattered across England and Wales, still on the chilly side, and that's the case into Friday. But by then, we've lost most of the showers, things beginning to settle down quite nicely, some good sunny skies coming through in most parts of the UK. And as I say, prospects for the weekend not looking too bad. A battle going on between high pressure to the north, low pressure to the south. But I think the high will win. So it looks like we're going to see a fair amount of sunshine around, a lot of dry weather, those chilly nights in the north but windy in the south. Well, that's it from me, but it really will be it from Michael Fish tomorrow. He slides gracefully into retirement and not a hurricane in sight. Good night.